And thank you so much for staying with us. Now, before you have that bowl of cereal or umtogo or whatever it is you're about to consume, rather listen to this interview first, right? One of South Africa's most high-profile scientists, is Professor Tim Noakes, also quite controversial, I'd say, has revolutionized the way that we look and consume a nutritional diet. In his new book, Raising Superheroes, co-authored with Bridget, Surtees and Jonno Proudfoot, he provides parents with the right dietary and nutritional advice and the recipes to raise the healthiest, brightest kids possible. Professor Tim Noakes joins us now from our Cape Town studios to tell us more about the book. Good morning to you, Prof. Thank you so much for joining us. We've had cookbooks for eons and centuries, decades perhaps even. Why is this one different?
I know when we wrote Real Meal Revolution, it was so well accepted by South Africans. We've sold over 200,000 copies, which shows the incredible reach of that book. A lot of people said, well, what about children? What do we feed them? And we said, well, it's not quite right. The dietary advice we gave in Real Meal Revolution was not absolutely perfect for children. So let's get down and write a book. And so whereas Real Meal Revolution focused on people who are already fat and obese and perhaps diabetic and gave them a solution for those problems. And by the way, the reason why it was so successful was because we said the problem if you're obese is not because you're the problem. It's because your choice of food is the problem. And all you have to do is change the choice of foods and you will get healthy. So we wrote this book because we don't believe that children have to be fat. We don't believe children have to be obese. We don't believe they have to have diabetes. And we believe that if mothers, from the moment that they conceived right through to the infant stage, if they feed their children properly, there's absolutely no reason why we have to have fat children who become diabetic already by the age of 10.
Well, your approach has certainly got more than a few tongues wagging. Is this banting for babies?
Not really, because the banting tends to be a very carbohydrate-restricted diet, and the more insulin resistant you are, the more obese, the more diabetic, we say you really must cut the carbohydrates to below 50 grams of carbohydrate per day. We don't believe that that's necessary for children until they show evidence that they've become insulin resistant. So I think the key point that people have to understand is that we all have a bias towards becoming insulin resistant. And we can only take so much carbohydrate in our lives because every time we eat carbohydrate, we become slightly more insulin resistant. And it might take 20 or 30 years for the negative effects to become apparent. But the more carbohydrate you eat and the more insulin resistant you become, the quicker the complications arise. So we're just saying restrict the carbohydrates a little bit so that instead of getting diabetes at 40 or 50 or 60 like I did because I ate so much carbohydrate, maybe you can get to 80 or 90 without ever having to develop the disease because you've strung out the carbohydrates over a much longer period. So that's the focus. We're not saying that every child has to completely avoid carbohydrate. We're saying no. It is possible to eat a little bit of carbohydrate, which is quite safe, and it's what we used to do 100 years ago. We had a restricted amount of carbohydrate. But don't overload the child from the day they are born with all this processed high carbohydrate, high sugar foods, which are simply going to make that child increasingly insulin resistant, obese, and at risk of developing diabetes.
You've just alluded to, your opinion that your first books and earlier perhaps contribution to this particular area have changed over the years. So it is possible that maybe 10 years from now, your views of what we're discussing today may have changed. Some people also lament the fact that banting is a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't fit everybody. Are you conceding that perhaps your views today, not only on children's nutrition, but on all nutrition, may be adjusted or changed as years go on?
Well, of course, I'm a scientist and we change as new information comes out. But the point you're missing is that this is the first diet ever described in 1862. The banting diet was the first diet used for the treatment of obesity. It is the first diet described in William Osler's textbook, The Principles and Practices of Medicine. Perhaps the greatest textbook ever written on medicine. In 1892, it describes the Banting-Epstein diet as the treatment for obesity. And the reason this diet works is because it's biologically based. That's the key. If you have insulin resistant, which is very prevalent, it's estimated today that 50% of North Americans have insulin resistant at the age of 50. By 65, it's estimated 75% have insulin resistant. And we don't teach that in our medical schools, and people deny its existence. But the very fact that we have such obesity and diabetes in this country tells us we have a high rate of insulin resistance. You cannot feed people with insulin resistance high carbohydrate diets without getting negative consequences. So, of course, the things will change. Of course, there's not a one diet fits all, because it's entirely dependent on how insulin resistant you are. If, like me, you're type 2 diabetic and extremely insulin resistant, if you want to live a reasonable life, you may not eat more than 25 grams of carbohydrate a day. On the other hand, if you're lean and insulin sensitive and an athlete, and you can probably eat 200 or 300 grams of carbohydrate a day, but it's within that range. So in a sense, it's one size fits all between 25 and 300 grams. But the irony is that we are told that there's one size fits all. We must all eat a high carbohydrate diet to be healthy. That's the problem. That advice doesn't appreciate that there are people with insulin resistance for whom that advice is absolutely deadly.
Prof, I'm going to have to interject there. Perhaps I'm a mom who's running late, because usually by 7 o'clock I should be taking the kids to school. I'm wondering what to pack in their lunchbox. How would you advise them, to give a balanced, nutritious diet as per the Raising Superheroes book?
Well, that's why we wrote the book, because there are so many menus and recipes, and we have a whole section on what to put in your lunchbox for the children. Our key is you must eat the proper breakfast. If you're eating a high sugar, high carbohydrate breakfast, that child will be hungry within 3 hours, and then they will want to eat what's in their lunch pack. We believe if you eat a proper breakfast full of fat and protein, the child shouldn't be hungry till 2 or 3 o'clock. So they only need a little bit of a snack in their lunchbox. They don't need a proper meal. So the meal must be the breakfast, and that's the key, because if you give them lots of fat and lots of protein for breakfast, they will not be hungry. And that's why this eating plan works so well, because it takes away hunger. And we don't have children who are addictively eating every 3 hours because they're driven by the sugar-driven foods that we're giving them.
So you don't think that there are children who just snack? Like I have a 5-year-old boy who, I've labeled a snacker because he's constantly munching away at things. He'll never sit down and finish a whole meal, but he'll want little bits and pieces everywhere. Am I perhaps not feeding him correctly? Should I bulk up his breakfast?
He's not getting enough fat in his breakfast. That's the problem. He's getting too much carbohydrate, too much sugar, and that's what causes you to snack. You don't want to snack. You see, you don't want all the time to be exposing your body to carbohydrate and raising the glucose and secreting insulin, because insulin is the hormone that causes the long-term problem, because it induces insulin resistance. So we know that the less frequently you eat, the better for you. So we don't want children eating every 3 hours, because that is setting them up for obesity and diabetes.
I consider
we want
myself
them to be eating every 6-8 hours. That's the way to go. And of course it conflicts with the advice that you get, but the biology is absolutely clear. The more frequently you eat, the higher your insulin, the quicker you get sick.
Okay, I have been thoroughly chastised. In about 20 seconds or so, in November, Prof, you'll be presenting your case to the Health Professions Council of South Africa on providing, quote, unconventional advice on breastfeeding babies and weaning babies. What will your argument be?
Well, this is the defense. This is the book. And this is the most important book, in my view, that has been written on infant nutrition. And it's full of everything. All I just ask people is read the book and tell me what's wrong with it, because there's nothing wrong with it. I've put many years, my 40 years of knowledge, but with the last year really researching it. And there's 150 references there showing exactly why children must be weaned onto animal produce. And that is the gold standard around the world. And we will have the World Authority in Cape Town at that hearing saying that what Dr. Noakes says is appropriate, because the evidence is abundantly clear.
We'll have
you
to
need
leave
to
it
raise
there.
your children on proper foods.
Thank you so much for that. Raising Superheroes is the name of the book, authored by the Professor Tim Noakes, as well as Bridget Surtees and Jonno Proudfoot. Thank you so much for your time, Prof, and for, I think, rebuking me on my eating habits or feeding habits of my children. I will try it. I think I'll test it, and the proof will be in the pudding or the eating thereof. Let's leave it there. Or maybe not pudding. We'll say something fatty. Quick ad break after that.